To the United States now, where the drama has been unfolding in Washington. The campaigning is well and truly underway in the Democratic primaries. Our reporter Annelise Nielsen is in Iowa ahead of the caucuses there next week. So we're a week away from the first electoral test in the Democratic primaries. Annelise, of course, the Iowa caucuses, and you've spent some time at the town hall of one of the frontrunners.
We have indeed today. It was with Elizabeth Warren, and it's certainly very different from Australian campaigns. We're so far out at this point, but every vote counts. And in particular, it's so important for the Democratic candidates. They have a long way to go before they pick who their candidate's going to be. But the Iowa caucuses are critical. The saying goes that there's 3 tickets out of Iowa. And that means that there's 3 Democratic candidates who will take that lead. We've seen in the past it's when Barack Obama came out of nowhere to be the front runner. It's also when we've seen Jimmy Carter really established the precedent of the caucuses being so important. So every vote counts. In particular, there has been a pretty tough time for some of those senators, including Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, who've been caught up with the impeachment trial. They haven't been out on the ground here meeting with voters like they need to have people in their corner for those critical Iowa caucuses. So today, Elizabeth Warren was getting the crowd fired up. Not everyone was necessarily there to support Elizabeth Warren. Many were there to hear her out. They were Democrats through and through, but they wanted to know who they should be supporting in those key caucuses. Elizabeth Warren's been really getting the crowds fired up with her message about taxing more for the wealthy and paying for some big social programs like free education with that. But it's a big sell to many, especially in Middle America.
Since I first got in this race a year ago, I have not focused on polls. And that's exactly how I'm going to continue to run this race. For me, it's all about things like tonight. It's about town halls and thousands now of unfiltered questions, and we're over 100,000 selfies. That's what it's about.
And Annelise, before turning to Iowa, you spent some time in Indiana and met with an individual who's quite close to another Democratic candidate, Mayor Pete Buttigieg.
I did indeed. We wanted to stop in and see South Bend, Indiana, because Pete Buttigieg has proven to be one of the really interesting candidates in this election. He was the mayor of South Bend, as you say, but he's also a very well-respected scholar, speaks a number of languages, also served in the military, but is a gay man, and he does have a husband, and that has been proving to be an issue with some conservative voters, in particular in the Midwest. When we were in South Bend, Indiana, though, we saw so much support for him, even just restaurants, hotels, when we were saying that we were there to meet with someone who knows Pete Buttigieg. We were hearing a lot of messages of support for him. He is seen as a very unusual candidate and much younger than the other candidates as well. So he is standing out in that way. This could be his chance to edge ahead. He's been on the ground in Iowa as well, meeting with many voters. But when I spoke to his pastor at his church, this is the same pastor who's counselled him through a number of life events, including marrying his husband, and he had nothing but good things to say.
You know, I certainly think he is not the flashiest candidate, but by the same token, I think one who is introspective, one who is really taking into consideration many, many views and perspectives in a kind of introverted style of leadership that is really thoughtful. I don't know that we need a rock star as president.
What's really hitting Pete Buttigieg's campaign isn't a lack of funds or a lack of support from his traditional base. It's those minority voters that prove so critical in the US election. He hasn't seen a lot of support from them, and we're hearing that when we were speaking to African-American voters as well. Now, I took a particular focus in African-American voters because their voter turnout was down at the last election. That was expected after Barack Obama's run, but there were some issues with Hillary Clinton as well, in particular her supporting Bill Clinton's 3 strikes and you're out laws, which saw so many African Americans incarcerated. So there is a real opportunity this time around for Democrats to have a candidate that does get African American voters fired up. And in a state like Wisconsin, where the electoral votes delivered a victory for Trump and only 22,000 voters were the difference, those African Americans make the biggest difference. And what we heard when we spoke to African American voters is that they know how powerful their vote is.
I do think that I take it a little more serious. I really, because my mom is still alive and she's 94, and I understand what was gone through for me to vote. She remembers vividly. She wasn't allowed to vote, we're a middle-class family. I can go get an ID. If I lose it, it's no big deal to pay $25 or whatever it costs to go get a new one. But for people that are already don't have transportation, they're already, you know, in a disproportionate place. And we've seen people that have gone to the polls and they say you're not on the list.
And Kieran, what Jazz is referencing in particular there is this issue that's impacted Wisconsin more than other states where they've been purging the electoral rolls. They say that's so that they can fight voter fraud, but it has been disproportionately affecting African-American voters. And as you heard there, it means that when they go to vote, they're not registered. They need to go back and get more ID. In some cases, that's not possible. And so there is a concern that that might impact the turnout. There's a lot of advocates out on the ground early to make sure that doesn't happen again this election.
Annelise Nielsen, thanks in Iowa. We'll talk to you over the next week. The Iowa caucuses, Monday, February 3rd. The results coming in to Australia in our newsroom through Tuesday, February 4. We'll catch you then. Thanks, Annelise.